Hi, I'm Sarah.
And I'm Rena, and welcome to
Biopic, a podcast story. This is a podcast where we dissect the good, bad, ugly, and absurd of this specific genre of motion picture, the biopic. If you want to learn more about us, our scoring system, and how we choose movies, please check out our special introductory episode, Introduction. Who are we and what are we doing?
Sarah. What movie are we doing this week?
This week, we will be talking about Maria, starring Angelina Jolie, and we are excited to welcome our second guest star, Sophia Lambton. Just a little bit about Sophia. She has been a professional classical music critic since she was 17 when she began writing for Musical Opinion, Britain's oldest music magazine. Since then, she has contributed to The Guardian, Bach Track, Music OMH, Broadway World, BBC Music Magazine, and Opera Wire, and conducted operatic research around the world for her book, The Callas Imprint, a centennial biography. This richly detailed account of Maria Callas' life was published to coincide with her 100th birthday in December 2023, and won the 2024 ARSC Award for Best Historical Research in Recorded Classical Music. She also hosts a Substack called Crepuscular Musings, which provides vivid explorations of TV and cinema together with reviews of opera, concerts, and recitals at sophialambton.substack.com. She has also written her first literary saga called The Crooked Little Pieces, and currently she's working on her second. And she lives in London. Welcome to the show, Sophia.
Thank you so much for having me, Rena and Sarah.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah.
Rena, would you like to give us the trigger warning?
Sure thing, Sarah. This movie contains depictions of pyromania, drug abuse, hallucination, adultery, misogyny, bad journalism, violence against journalists, emotional abuse, child abuse, Nazis, sex work, and no-boundary, emotionally manipulative employer-employee relationships. Sarah, can you think of anything I may have left out?
Nope. Rena, can you also give us the spoiler warning?
Spoiler warning! We are going to spoil everything, including possibly the major plot points in works of narrative art having nothing to do with this particular movie. Consider yourself warned. Normally at this point, we talk about the sources we used, but we have our source here with us this week. Sophia, can you please give our listeners a 300-second primer on Maria Callas?
Oh my God. Okay. She was a Greek-American soprano born in Manhattan in December 1923. Her mother, who was very negligent and not loving, took her and her older sister Jackie to Athens. She was there during the war, but also during the much more violent, at least in Athens, Greek Civil War. She came back to New York in October 1945. She worked there for a while, for 2 years. Well, didn't really work there that much. Tried to make a career, went to Verona in June 1947. Eventually, she had a wonderful career there, mostly in Italy, France, the UK, and the US, but generally traveling over Europe and the States. She was married to a man much older than she was, in fact, 28 years older than she was, Giovanni Battista Meneghini. He was also the manager of her career. He dumped her when she told him she wanted to marry her career independently after a huge financial mistake on his part. And eventually she had a relationship with Aristotle Onassis, and she actually dumped him 3 months before he married Jacqueline Kennedy, which many of your listeners may know. Most horribly for her, she had a horrific vocal decline owing to many factors, primarily due to damage in the stomach muscles, but also sinusitis and hernias contributed to it. And eventually she sang less and less. So yeah, the end of her life was not happy. It's true this movie gets that right, I guess, but that's a very broad observation you could make about millions of people who've existed. And that's a very short summary. Yeah.
Yes, you came up at least 100 seconds short.
Where can I go back to? Well, she revolutionized opera. She revolutionized opera by firstly being able to sing both bel canto, which is very difficult ornamental romantic music from the 19th century, but also Wagner, which requires a very, very heavy voice. It's also difficult music, but from a different perspective. And she restored to the repertoire many operas that were not being performed and let them crawl out of the woodwork.
So my primary background on Callas was from going to see Zoe Caldwell in Terrence McNally's master class on Broadway as a birthday present when I was a teenager. And from finding a New Yorker article, a rather old one, about why she lost her voice, where they say she sang too high in her chest voice and that you can hear it on a Nabucco recording from like 1949 or something. But I have no idea what they're talking about. I was just reading this because I was at a stage in my life where I aspired to read most of the New Yorker every week.
There's a lot there. So firstly, the Terence McNally play masterclass is deeply fictional. I actually recorded a whole other episode of a whole other podcast about Callas' time at Juilliard because that is such a fun topic. She was very helpful to so many students. They were only 28, but I wanted to talk about how she talked to them on the phone, for hours, advising them how to sing arias, how she rehearsed with them outside of the classes. And in fact, when I interviewed Callas' final vocal coach, who was Janine Reiss, a wonderfully elegant French lady who's no longer with us, she told me she had seen that play in French, presumably with Fanny Ardant, I think, in Paris. And she was so distraught by this fictional depiction of her friend that she said she actually threw up during the interval.
This vocal cord coach was a class act, clearly a perfect lady if she managed to hold it for the interval.
That never occurred to me. I wish I had said that to her now. When I was with her, she was my first interviewee and I was so nervous and I was doing it in French.
I want to talk a little bit about you before we get into the movie because I have many questions. First of all, you started reviewing classical music when you were 17. How did this happen? How did you get into this and what inspired you to start looking to it as something to write about?
I'm naturally, I'm a novelist. I create fiction. But I also have a very deeply analytical side that has, I guess, something to do with that, but not much. I mean, I do research for my novels, and that's always fun. But I knew I wanted to write regularly about something because my way of working is very different. I actually don't write that often. I write very much when I write, but not that often. So I think I just remember being about 14 and saying, because I don't want to be a journalist. I don't want to be reporting on current events. I've honestly never had much interest in current events. I mean, I guess you could say I've led a sheltered enough existence to be able to say that, right? But I wanted to write about classical music. I admittedly am not a musician. I was a very, very bad pianist, if you could even call me that. Until the age of 13, I was so bad. I failed my grade 5 and had to retake it. That's our system in the UK. We have 8 grades for piano tuition mainly for children, but I guess adults take those exams too. But I was intoxicated by music. I have been music obsessed apparently since the age of 1 because my mum told me I apparently sat through a Mozart piano concerto when I was 1 and didn't even make any noise and, just sat intensely watching the concerto being played. I was lucky enough to basically just write a letter to the editor of Musical Opinion, Bob Matthew Walker, who was a very, very kind guy, and asked if I could do work experience. He said, well, we don't really do that, but how do you want to review this event? Which was actually, it was a Carmen, but it was a Carmen at a school that I was familiar with. So it was a professional production being held at a high school. So it wasn't a production of the students. It was a production by professionals, but it was at the high school. Anyway, so yeah, I was 17 then, and then shortly after I did begin reviewing, at the real places, so the Royal Opera House, Barbican, Royal Festival Hall, Wigmore Hall, those are our main classical music venues here in London. Even though it's not the major part of my life, I will say I'm a very part-time classical music critic. I want to do it because it allows me to document a performance, and a live performance is something that's ephemeral. So if it's good, you want it to somehow go down in history. I genuinely want to detail what makes a performer different, whether they have performed well or badly, to make that unique stamp in history of something that is, a lot of the time, even these days, not being recorded.
Why? What do you love about Maria Callas? Like, what brought you to her as subject matter?
Well, I was brought to her as a subject matter because, contrary to what many people assume, she was a very, very relatable, warm, sympathetic woman. She was, I don't know if casual is the right word, but her cousin called her down to earth. I had the stereotypical, she must have been a diva thing in my head when I first began to listen to her interviews. And then I began to listen and I thought, but she is a lover of music. She is humble before music. She's humble before the composers, before her colleagues. And then I would find out so many anecdotes about how cooperative she was, how she had helped several singers with their careers. But what she was she was a team player. She recognized herself as a very small part of a giant field, which is opera. And she wanted to give her best, and she overexerted herself trying to give her best. And she was absolutely the opposite of a diva, because at least in our modern understanding, a diva is somebody who is trying to make life harder on other people to make life easier for herself, usually. So, like, oh, get me this, get me that, make sure this is this way. She was the opposite. She kept making life harder for herself. She would come to rehearsal 2 hours early. Maria Callas was very short-sighted, and she had to have a mental map of the stage of all the props so as not to bump into things. So it's very sad for me to see her constantly being depicted as someone who was making other people's lives harder when she was making her own life the hardest and not doing herself any favors that way a lot of the time.
Is there anything else like that the world has gotten wrong about her, either as a human or as an artist, or both? Just like a broad misconception? I would be interested to hear if there's other things that really haven't been shown about her.
She was a fun human. If you listen to those Juilliard classes, and they're all on YouTube, the full audio of all the Juilliard master classes, she had such a lovely sense of humor. And she was so self-loathing. So she would say, it has happened to me that I have been wildly applauded after a performance, and I have cried bitterly because I knew I haven't been able to serve the composer the way that he intended. You will have seen a character who was supposed to be the real life conductor Jeffrey Tate being the accompanist on the piano. I interviewed the real Jeffrey Tate, and he said she was incredibly sweet. So that's it. In terms of artistically, what people don't discuss enough is how she really manipulated her instrument to sound like the character. So when she was singing Madame Butterfly, a Japanese geisha of 15 years old, she would actually shape her vowels to sound like a Japanese person, even though the libretto of the opera is in Italian. So her instrument could sound so different that you're stunned, you're just floored that this is the same vocalist. And I don't think that gets touched on enough. I think there's too much, not too much, but I think there's a lot about, she was so emotional as a performer, of course, but so are very, very many other opera singers. And what really makes her different was the risks she took with her voice to make it so closely identifiable with a character that she's just incarnated a role. She was very believable.
Do you have a favorite opera or a favorite performance that you kind of always go back to in your head?
Oh my God, I have so many. In terms of Callas, I'm always going to miss one out and then regret having not said it, but I love Maria Callas' Manon score. I like to mention it because actually she thought it was really bad. She wouldn't let the record be published, released for 2 years because she was so worried it was so bad. But I love it. It's amazing. I love her Carmen, the studio recording of 1964, not to be confused because she did other recordings of the arias from Carmen that weren't as good. Her Traviatas, there are several recordings of live ones. I love the one from May 1955 at La Scala, also the one from 1957 from Covent Garden from London. In general, my favorite operas are Madame Butterfly, Queen of Spades, Traviata, Otello. I mean, I'm quite an operaphile, so I'm going to leave something out, but so I'll leave it there.
I think that opera unfairly has a reputation of being really unapproachable. And I'm curious, as someone who has been so steeped in this art form, if someone wanted to get into opera, where would you recommend they begin?
You are absolutely right. Opera has a reputation for being unapproachable. I think there are two main reasons here. The first is it's very, very expensive. So the tickets are very, very expensive. So it seems like a rich people thing to do. When actually, originally, it was quite the opposite. I mean, when you go to Italy, you hear buskers playing Verdi songs, Verdi arias and choruses. It's originally a kind of the masses, an art for the masses. There's nothing intellectual about it, and the plots are really stupid and silly and laughable. Find a voice you like, and then figure out what kind of music you like. I think most people tend to be drawn to Verdi and Puccini, super popular Italian composers. So, do something like find a singer, say Leontine Price, and then type in Carmen, because that was actually one of my first ever opera recordings given to me by my father. I think my father gave me Leontine Price's Carmen. Look up Leontine Price Carmen on YouTube or Spotify. or look up Jesse Norman singing Wagner. I think the easiest thing is to listen to arias first and then figure out which composers you like. And then if you feel interested enough to listen to an opera, by that time, you'll probably have a feeling for whether you want to be listening to Verdi, Puccini, Wagner, potentially Bellini, not the most popular composer, but Rossini, or Handel. You might go backwards in time.
And one question we always ask is, do you have a favorite biopic?
Well, that's very interesting because you are the first to ever have asked me this question. I can't really say I have a favorite biopic, but there are several films I've seen that I like that are kind of biopics, including The Sound of Music being the Von Trapp family. Oddly, coincidentally, the only other Angelina Jolie film I've seen, except for this one, and I think I saw Mr. and Mrs. Smith when I was 11 or something, which was Girl Interrupted, which is actually based on Susanna Kayson's memoir, which I've read. I like Girl Interrupted. And I, Tonya, which was inspired by Tonya Harding, who actually approved of the film. I like I, Tonya because I'm also a huge figure skating follower.
Fantastic. Yes, and Sarah, can you please give us some background on the Netflix movie Maria starring Angelina Jolie?
Maria is a 2024 biographical psychological drama film about Maria Callas. It's directed by Pablo Larraín, written by Stephen Knight, and is an international co-production between Italy, Germany, and the United States. And it is the third film in Larraín's trilogy of important 20th century women, or as I like to call it, the Manic Pixie Dream Ladies Who Lunch series, which also features Jackie and Spencer about the life of Princess Diana. The movie premiered at the Venice Film Festival and was in competition for the Golden Lion. It just released on Netflix and is now available for viewing there. And those are all the numbers we have at this point. Sophia, I'm going to ask if you wouldn't mind, anytime you want to call out something they got wrong as we're walking through the plot, please feel free.
I'm going to try, but I mean, it'll be hard. It is hard because it's very, very fictional. So other than she's a singer, she wears glasses, she had dark hair, anything beyond that is really up for question.
That makes me worry that we'll be taping all night. So we open on almost the exact same framing device used in Angelina Jolie's breakthrough movie, Gia, 25 years ago. The eponymous character has just died, and then we cut to black and white footage of Jolie singing as Maria, and back and forth between that and what looks like old video footage of Callas during her career and in her private life. One of the red flags that you are about to watch a weak biopic is the use of multiple framing devices to try to pique the audience's interest in something, anything. We saw this in Gotti, which opened with a desperate Russian nesting doll of 4 framing devices. My immediate thoughts were, oh no, I am less than 5 minutes into this film, and it has already reminded me of 2 of the 10 worst movies that we have talked about on this show.
I agree with all of your concerns. Within 5 minutes, I'm going, oh no, I'm not going to make it. I'm not going to make it. I think it was more elegantly done than Gotti. I know that's going to surprise you because that was such an elegant motion picture.
Was this one with John Travolta?
Yep. It also had 38 producers, which is always the hallmark of a well-made film. I couldn't help but notice, Rena, and I think I texted you about this earlier, that this also shared a format with a couple of not great things. One of them is this movie called Boom. It's one of the lesser Richard Burton, Liz Taylor collaborations where she is taken through like the end of her life by...
Wait, I have to interrupt you there actually, oddly enough, to tell you that Callas was offered that role in that film. She didn't take it because she couldn't relate to the character because contrary to what this film presents, that character, she said she was always cursing, and actually Maria Callas never cursed. She said, I preferred not to start off a film career with a difficult role, that of a woman of a certain age who speaks in slang, who swears.
Smart. And also Shutter Island, and also I Am the Cheese, which was a YA book from the 70s about a kid in a mental facility who's sort of like relating to all these characters who are ultimately fake. And yeah, as you said, we open on she's dead. And also, I'm really tired of watching people lip sync. I don't want to watch people lip sync anymore. And that's just my personal beef. That's that. And she also has amazing style in this movie, right down to her glasses, which I loved her glasses. And we're seeing all sorts of other things that she did, maybe burning her clothes.
Well, if you want, I could get into the costume burning thing because it was grossly misrepresented.
Why would she have still owned her opera costumes? Because my understanding was that these things are very expensive to produce and that the costumes remain in the archive of the opera company that commissioned them so that they can be reused, or so that if you get a star the next season who's like a drastically different size, you have something to work from to copy.
Yes, most of the time they are kept by the Opera House, and in fact, the famous Callas Tosca dress from 1964 is still at the Royal Opera House in London here. She brought some of her own costumes to certain productions because she found the costumes for productions supplied in smaller theatres in Italy. So places like Bologna or Palermo, and not the major, not Milan or Rome or Venice. She found those costumes tacky, shabby. There's a lovely memory of the film director Luchino Visconti, who would later direct her in opera, and remembering how the first time he saw her in Wagner's Parsifal, she was wearing what looked like a bra with a little hat that kept falling on her nose. So a lot of these costumes were not ideal. She also said that they stank. In a letter to her husband, she said, "Oh gosh, I have to wear these costumes. They stink of sweat," she said, like they hadn't been washed after the previous singer. But she did burn some costumes, not the ones apparently depicted in this film. It's tough to tell which roles they're supposed to be in some cases. I actually read the screenplay to this film. The screenplay said one of them had the tag Anna Bolena, which she would never have burnt because that was a costume from a Visconti production at La Scala in 1957. I don't know in what year she burnt her costumes, but she spoke about this frankly in a 1965 French interview. She said, "That's a past that I didn't like. That is to say, it was before the birth, my birth artistically. So once tastes change, the body changes, one changes artistically." And as some of your listeners may know, Maria Callas for quite a few years was very, very heavy, and she decided to lose weight. She lost about 95 pounds in a span of 18 months. So I guess a while after that, looking at the shabby, tacky, cheap costumes probably that the Opera House had provided her, although she would bring some of her own ones, she would also use her husband's mother, who was a dressmaker, to find or make some props or costumes. At one point, she did burn them, but we're talking about really shabby, tacky costumes. We are not talking about the most expensive, exquisite costumes still housed in some opera houses, or but some are in the Maria Callas Museum in Athens. Some feature in other exhibitions. So, Rena, to answer your questions, in most cases, opera costumes should be kept by the Opera House.
Yes. So she burns the costumes, and then we cut to it is the morning, and she accuses the dogs of being food whores. Then she has her butler, who has a bad back, move the piano again.
That was never reported, by the way. That just annoyed me because it was a motif in the film. And Ferruccio, I personally do not speak to the butler, who's Ferruccio Mezzadi. He's still alive today. I do not speak to him because I talked to someone who knew him, Fabio Gervasoni, who said Ferruccio refuses to speak about Maria Callas. He's sick of the lies. Since then, actually, he has written his own book, which was helpful to me. But he's a very elderly gentleman, and I didn't particularly want to bother him, especially since he wrote his own book. It didn't have that much detail. But she was never rude. She was never bossy to him. She was very gentle with both him and the maid in this film, Bruna, who was her real maid, Bruna Lupoli. That whole moving piano thing just got on my nerves because it made no sense and it had no basis in reality.
So then she goes to have Bruna make her an omelet, and over the sound of the omelet sizzling, she sings. And so I read that they had some kind of technological thing where they would blend Jolie's voice with recordings of Callas. And I'm afraid I have no ear for classical. I come from the pop world where we judge good by someone is singing their own work with a sense of grit and edge and intensity and maybe a big voice. So all I could hear is, well, she sounds much better than this at me or than 95% of people. And Bruna tells her she sounded magnificent, but there's the whole idea that a housemaid can't tell. So how does she sound?
Okay, so I did make a list of all the recordings featured in the film, but I don't remember the Casta Diva. I assume that Jolie sings some of that. Actually, I forgot to list that one right at the beginning. Ironically, to prepare for this podcast, I listened to my own interview with Jeffrey Tate, who was the repetiteur, the accompanist featured in this film, the real Jeffrey Tate. And I didn't remember this from my interview with him, but he went to see a play that was supposed to be based on Callas's relationship with Bruna in Italian. And he actually remarked, in the play, she says, "Oh, how's my voice, Bruna?" And he remarked, "What a silly thing for them to be showing her asking the maid how her voice is. Why would she doing that?" So it's funny that he remarked on that years before this movie was made. Now tell me, Rena, is it supposed to be depicting that she can't sing, or is she flashbacking? Because I forgot. Is she flashbacking during the Casta Diva in the kitchen?
I have no idea, because it's possible that she's supposed to sound good here and she's hallucinating, and Bruna doesn't know what she's talking about. And also, I found the pianist to be the character that I actually cared the most about in this film. He was sympathetic. He was worshipful. He just wanted to help her, and he felt very, very privileged to be working this closely with her.
He only worked with her for 6 weeks. He was actually very shy. He was quite young, Jeffrey Tate, at the time. Must have been in his 20s at the time. He then became a conductor. He was chosen to work with her because, contrary to what this movie is constantly suggesting, oh, she's retired, she hasn't sung in years. That's not true. She had last sung in November 1974, and this movie wants to start off on the last day of her life, which is the 16th of September 1977. And she was constantly considering engagement. So she worked with him potentially to prepare for a production of Cavalleria Rusticana at the Royal Opera House in March 1976, only for 6 weeks. So she was not working with him by this period. He said she never discussed her personal life with him, except to occasionally she might say something like, "Oh, my relationship with Narcissus didn't work out," or something very broad, nothing too intimate. I kept trying to drag specifics out of him. He called her extremely sweet. He said he could treat her like any other normal singer. Those were his words. That he could say, "Oh, Maria, do that again. That was flat." That they discussed technique a lot. I mean, he was quite honest with her in that everybody by then knew her voice was in a really bad way. He said, "I found it pleasant to be with her. She was very agreeable to be with." And he then rang her up again in September, October 1976, offering to work again with her. But I felt sorry for him watching this film because I met the guy and I thought he was being depicted like some kind of total impudent idiot, because I met the guy and he was so reverent, and he was telling me how he was scared of initially of working with Maria Callas, who was just this legend. And this guy obviously is being used as a narrative device so that the fictional Maria Callas can report more about her private life and do things she wouldn't have done and she didn't do with the real Jeffrey Tate in real life. She was not as reclusive as she has very, very often been described to be. She was going to meet in the next few days the choreographer Maurice Béjart because they were discussing a potential film project about singing, but she couldn't meet him because she felt ill. Obviously, as we know, she would die of a heart attack that day. And she was planning to visit her friend George Moore in Sotogrande, Spain, within 2 weeks of her death. So the idea that, everything is very, very bleak and she's completely isolated from the world is fictional.
Oh, so Sarah, is it right after this that we learn about the Mandrax, which Mandrax is Quaaludes, or I've read Quaaludes plus an antihistamine. So that is the drug that they are referring to.
My first thought was, this must be fake, because that doesn't sound like a real drug. And it is.
It is. Although the name, it sounds like an aphrodisiac member of the potato family.
Or like a Bond villain.
It does. And then it is also the name of the young interviewer who we immediately understand is not real because he shares a name with this drug. Drugs don't work this way. You don't consistently hallucinate the same thing to have conversations with.
One of the first things that I heard about this film was the mention of Mandrax, which was very surprising to me because it is true Maria Callas took Mandrax, but she did not have a substance abuse disorder of any kind whatsoever. It is mentioned later on in the film that she asked her sister to get them because they were not on the market in France, that's true, but they were legal in the United States. They were on the market in the United States until 1983. So on 2 occasions in her life, which was when she was supposed to sing at Carnegie Hall on the 17th of February, 1974, and also on the 25th of May, 1970, so almost 4 years before that, she took too many sleeping pills and she was found unconscious because she wouldn't wake up. and she had to be given an emetic, so, something to vomit. But those were unfortunate incidents. They were not indicative of a substance abuse disorder. She never had hallucinations, so this is just a device employed by the film.
Yes, my note here was Quaaludes, what is this, the Wolf of Wall Street?
She's going to chat with Mandrax, and they're like, is he real? And she's like, I don't know. And this is sort of the device by which this film moves, is that she's sort of sharing pieces of her life with different people, and kind of building it into a portrait of who she is, and, well, more accurately, who the film wants to present her as. You did come to love the framing device for the most part. It was interesting, kind of kept some of the ponderousness of the film at bay. There's a lot of like very purple talky. Some of the conversational choices and the statements that are made are very very on the nose, and loaded, and so much so that there were a few times where I was like, oh, are we really doing this? She does this interview for a bit, and then we're going toward the theater, and she's got this coat on that I was very covetous of.
Costumes in this are gorgeous.
Yes.
And the things where they copy something where there's a photo looks amazing.
This film also doesn't depict at all the changes in weight, which is also why the costume burning thing seems to make no sense, because there are flashbacks to her as Medea. And I presume that that's the Bernstein Medea of 53, where Callas would have been quite heavy. But throughout, we're only seeing Angelina Jolie's physique. So it's not letting the viewers in on that history.
I really liked, I liked the scenes. We have talked about, Jeffrey Tate and how he's portrayed in this. But I did like how those scenes, I felt like to your point, Rena, like those were the scenes where I felt like the most, like he was the most sort of sympathetic person in it. And I thought that this was where you sort of, I felt personally like we saw the most humanity out of Maria in these scenes, at its most like flourishing in these scenes. Like that's where it feels most like this was my favorite part of Angelina Jolie's performance, was watching her in these interactions.
I predictably, I don't think I could really like anybody as Callas, but I've actually seen quite a few actresses as Callas. I have seen Fanny Ardant in the Zeffirelli film Callas Forever. I also saw Stephanie Beacham. Do you know Stephanie Beacham?
Oh, I know Stephanie Beacham. She was Dylan McKay's mom on Beverly Hills 90210.
She was Dylan McKay's mom on Beverly Hills. I had forgotten that. I was going to say she was in Dynasty. Right. But I grew up watching her in the British series Bad Girls, which was about women in prison. So I saw Stephanie Beacham in Masterclass very many years ago before I decided to write my book. I also saw Tyne Daly in Masterclass. All of these women are working from different scripts and different depictions of Callas, but just from my personal perspective, I thought Jolie was by far the worst. Firstly, the voice is completely not Callas's. The accent reminded me of Kristen Stewart trying to do Diana in Spencer. It was very, very London. Callas's accent would fluctuate, so it's a very, very difficult one to pin down. And it was quite European, but then it could be American, and sometimes it sounded like Katharine Hepburn. I think the easiest way would be to kind of go with a more transatlantic accent, so like Hollywood in the 40s or 50s, kind of not Cary Grant, but somewhere like Katharine Hepburn, but with a European kind of twang. But I would say my major problem, putting aside the fact that, as you said, Sarah, this script, oh my God, because I read the screenplay at first because it was available on Deadline before the movie came out, I thought, is this a parody? Is this kind of some kind of SNL skit on Maria Callas? It was bizarre. And it was nothing like the way she spoke, because she could be really casual and definitely did not speak like that. I would say I just did not feel any emotional changes in Angelina Jolie's performance. She came across as very staid, very subdued, very contrary to Callas, who firstly also spoke very quickly, because this fictional Callas kind of speaks slowly, as probably per the director's wishes. In real life, Callas spoke quickly. She had this very jumpy language, even when she was depressed. Even when she was depressed, she was very animated. So I did not track changes, and especially between the flashbacks and the present day.
There's such a remoteness about Angelina Jolie in some performance, like just in recent years in particular, like, because you mentioned Girl Interrupted at the beginning of this show, and it's a good movie, and her performance in that is very, very raw and feels like a little bit dangerous. I don't know that she's been able to translate that energy and channel it in other directions, like, because you could bring a raw sense of danger to Callas or to any character that you're playing, and still be a different character.
Absolutely. I really haven't followed her career, so I'm not familiar with anything after Mr. and Mrs. Smith. I don't know why. I grew up hearing about her as this kind of wild party girl. I don't know how true that was, so I'm not going to replace Callas myths with Jolie myths. That wouldn't be fair. But it's really weird seeing this very kind of repressed performance, especially playing one of the greatest performers, theatrical performers of all time. She had the energy of someone who's 79 or 80, but he said she was still such a strong personality to be around, even in that state.
I'm going to cut to this since she and Jeffrey Tate are dealing with it. Sophia, why did Callas lose her voice so early?
God, this is such a giant mystery. I, in my book, preferred not to pin down a cause because ultimately anything is going to be speculative. So the chronology goes like this. In 1953, she decided to lose a lot of weight, which she did. She lost about 95 pounds in about 18 months. After that, it is true that her voice sounded different, so the timbre of her voice sounded somewhat thinner. However, even that is somewhat speculative because there were some roles she played, especially if she was playing young women, for instance, young kind of naive ingenue women, where she would make that timbre thinner on purpose. So you can argue on one hand, is her natural timbre thinner or is she making it thinner? And I think both of them are true. That truth alternates from character to character, shall we say. Now, when a singer loses weight, when anybody loses weight, that shouldn't be destructive to any voice. But the fat cells shrink, and because the singer is using the diaphragm, the singer pushes the contents of the stomach up against the stomach muscles. And if the fat cells are smaller, that means that the singer is pushing up less content against those stomach muscles, which means, according to one report I read by an ear, nose, and throat doctor called Dr. Anthony Jane, it means you should be retraining yourself to kind of use your stomach muscles differently. Now, Maria Callas had an exceptional vocal technique. She was formidably trained, and you can hear that in her legato and her phrasing, and she had phenomenal breath control. But I will admit that she wasn't very familiar with this idea of particularly using different muscles. So I don't think, other than chest voice and head voice and, singing in the mask, those kinds of things, I'm not sure to what extent she was familiar with potentially changing where she'd be using the voice. However, she also had many, many health problems that we'll get into later. None of them actually depicted in this film, except that there is a mention of a hernia. And yes, she had at least 2 hernias that we know of. She had sinusitis, which really affected her voice. She said that when she sang, the pus drips on my vocal cords and I force my voice and it's like a deaf man who can't hear himself shout. So she had to have an operation for that in December 1962. She had hernias and she had an operation for one of them in January 1963. She didn't have the other one operated on because the doctor said potentially she could risk harming her voice even more. Throughout her life, she had various health problems, including lethally low blood pressure, which was what caused a heart attack, anemia, acne, eczema. She would have swollen legs. She was allergic to antibiotics. She had various health problems, but her voice just got worse and worse and worse. Definitely from the end of 1957, but you can even hear some problems in 1954. However, she attributed it to weakening stomach muscles. That's what she told her friend, the music critic Irving Culloden, that she was trying to strengthen them. And actually, she would tell people, I've been doing breathing exercises to strengthen my stomach muscles. And she told, have you seen the Pasolini films? She shot Medea with him. And when she was filming that, she told the actor playing Jason, who was actually the Olympic jumper Giuseppe Gentile, so another non-actor, she would say, punch me in the stomach as hard as you can, because she was trying to prove, look, I've strengthened my stomach muscles. And she would say the same thing to the physiotherapist that she and Onassis had, Carina Spanidu, and she said the same thing to Pasolini's lover, Ninetto Davoli. So she knew it was because of weakening stomach muscles. She also, she would go to various specialists, all the ear, nose, and throat doctors. She would go to lung specialists. She was told, your vocal cords are in perfect shape. So it was all about what was inside, and it was not something she could remedy. It was horrifying, and it broke her. She was broken by a progressing vocal decline that was getting worse and worse and worse, and still she was trying to sing all the time. She practiced every day. That was her life, right up until she died. She was practicing every day.
Let's talk about a couple of people who enter into her life throughout this film. So we meet Ari Onassis in a flashback, and these are all done in black and white. And I thought the actor playing him, I'm going to just butcher his name right now because I don't pronounce things. He's a Turkish actor named Haluk Bilginer. And I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, but I thought he looked a lot like Ari, but he was kind of a Hollywood Ari though too. But I really liked him in the role. I thought he captured what I have seen of him.
This is something I've said before, that when they hire, it's always that person 2.0, because anyone who can make it as an actor is going to be better looking anyway.
Yes.
That's true. I did not like this version of Onassis, although I will admit I don't know how much the actor could have done when the script was so extremely misleading from every perspective. Onassis was quite a boyish, kind of infantile, goofy guy to a degree. Obviously, he could be elegant when he needed to be, but Callas really loved him for his boyish charms. He was kind of a prankster, so when one of her hairdressers entered his yacht, the Christina, he actually pretended to be the waiter and served him rum and didn't mention he was Onassis. So he was kind of playful. He was not ostentatious at all, especially not the way he's depicted in this film. I have come to feel real sympathy for Onassis because he is just really, really villainized across the board. If you want to go right back to the very beginning, because I know we have this black and white flashback in the film. It's funny, in the screenplay it said her husband Meneghini was in his 40s and he was actually 63 by this time. So I found that funny in the screenplay.
He looked 63.
Yeah.
My question was, Meneghini, why did she wind up with such an older man?
Well, Rena, you see, this is to do with what actually hasn't been touched on almost at all, which is actually so you start out with, we have Maria Callas, who is born to parents who are not very loving, to put it mildly. So her mother just showed no sympathy for her, pushed her to be a singer. Now, thankfully, Maria Callas wanted to be a singer, so that was a happy coincidence. But her mother just was not sympathetic to her or to her sister. She took Jackie and her from Athens when Maria, was 13. So Maria didn't grow up, at least her teenage years, she didn't see her dad, George, but George was obviously not as terrible as her mother, Evangelia. But on the other hand, there's an interview of her with George where George doesn't remember his daughter's birthdays. He gets both of them wrong. Maria Callas never had a keen interest in men. She was not a very sexual person. And this is actually what really has been, in a lot of biographies, it's been very understated. There are, at least counting Maria herself, there are 9 different sources that basically mention, she wasn't really that into sex. She would say, I didn't know how babies were born because I wasn't particularly interested.
So later in the film, when it's in the black and white portion where they show her and her sister performing for the German soldiers, and her mother sends her into the room with the Nazi soldier. And I did give them credit for finding a younger, heavier actress for realism's sake for this. But did that happen?
No. So that would have been by about 42, 43. It is true that Evangelia wanted her girls to go out with Nazi soldiers in the hope of getting food. I don't think Evangelia said prostitute yourselves, which was what was implied. Maria only went out with a German soldier once and burst into tears, and he took pity on her and gave her food anyway. At least that was what she told her friend, the mezzo-soprano Giulietta Simeonati. Other than that, she remained a virgin throughout the war. She had flirtations with a few men. None of them were German soldiers. One of them was a Brit. The other 2 were Greeks. All 3 men from this period whom she kind of dated referenced the fact that she was not really into physical intimacy. She fell in love with Meneghini just because he was a fatherly older figure who showed affection for her. And she didn't realize, unfortunately, the fact that he was also a businessman. He had a brick making factory that had 12 plants in Italy, 12 plants in different regions. She didn't realize he was going to try to use her to make money from her name. She met him when she was 23 and he was 28 years older, so he would have been 51. She just thought, even though he was unattractive, he was bald, he was overweight, but she thought, what a lovely man.
Hey.
She was kind of potty in his hands because he was just a nice person who'd come up. And at a time when she really needed someone, when she'd recently arrived to Verona, didn't know anybody. She did speak Italian. She'd learned Italian during the war, speaking with Italian soldiers because Athens was occupied by Germans and Italians. But, she didn't know anybody. And here comes this guy who's kind of courting her, promising her a lot, and she's just putty in his hands.
So what happens next? She comes home from theater. I guess I'm getting things out of order because it is episodic and nonlinear. She meets with this doctor. She goes to a restaurant where she sits outside and an American mentions, she didn't show for a show that he bought tickets to. And she has a whole scene.
I think the thing that would have hurt her the most, maybe even hurt her more than the insinuation that she had a substance abuse disorder when she didn't. I think the thing that would have hurt her the most was the idea that she could have been rude to a fan. Because not only was she never rude to her fans, I mean, truly, never. There was, when you research a person, you get a lot of material. And of course, there were a few people who had some issues with Maria Callas, but never a fan. She was so warm-hearted to her fans. She would receive them in her dressing room, stay with them in her dressing room until 3 a.m. signing autographs. So the idea that, and also, throughout this film, I don't know if you were going to touch on it, but at a certain point, she says something like, I was so angry at the public. She'd never said that because she said herself, the masses, they can make you or break you. They are very changing, but they have the right to be. It is the law of the theater. She lived to create art for their sake. So she never in her life ever was rude to a fan.
So where does this idea of her as this cruel diva come from?
Well, to be honest, I was surprised by how much this film, even being fictional, really emphasized the cruel thing, because that wasn't even really ever part of the Callas myth, even when she was at her height. As you know, she started to experience a vocal decline, but also she really exhausted herself and she had to occasionally cancel performances because she did actually fall ill. She never canceled on a whim.
I often found myself thinking of that repeat line from the interview scenes in I, Tonya, which you mentioned earlier as a favorite, Sophia, where they'll recount something and then someone angrily barks. This never happened.
So she was quite often unwell and she would push herself. She would overexert herself. And in July 1957, the doctor said, you have exhaustion, don't sing. And she continued to perform. So what are you going to do? This is what she was doing.
We keep bouncing back and forth between these things. Mandrax tells her that he's in love with her. We meet JFK, who is played by the same actor who played JFK in Pablo Larraín's Jackie, which means we have a shared cinematic universe.
Yeah, this guy, I was like, is this after he's dead and she's fantasizing about it? Or are they positing that they have this meeting?
It felt like a real wipe swap situation. Like he was kind of like, hey, do you wanna?
No, it didn't happen. Not only did it not happen, but she and JFK barely met. I mean, they did meet because she performed at his birthday party, 19th of May, 1962. Yes, that was the same evening as when Marilyn Monroe sang Happy Birthday, Mr. President. She barely met him. When Callas got to Madison Square Garden, she felt a draft and she was immediately terrified it would affect her voice. So she asked the event organizer, Clive David, where she could go, where it would be warmer and there would be less air. So he told her to go to a closet. So she hid in a closet because she was terrified that the cold draft would affect her voice. So she didn't really spend that much time chatting to either Kennedy or Marilyn Monroe. He did gift her a bowl, a silver bowl, that had an inscription that said, to Maria Callas, who fulfilled the prophecy of President John Kennedy, our generation shall be remembered for its artists.
I'm going to go so far as to say it seems like there was very clearly an agenda of the story that they wanted to tell here, and they didn't allow some of the factual nature of Maria Callas's life or anyone that she knew or anything like that get in the way with kind of the story that they wanted to present. We see her visit Ari Onassis at his deathbed, and all of this other stuff is happening that's kind of bringing us to that ending point where her housekeeper and her cook discover her body in the apartment. I'm sure this was a choice, but it was interesting. The movie went silent at that point. Like they took her voice from the film.
Well, one thing they did here that I felt real was when she dies and the dogs howl, because I've been in a house where the pet owner has just died and the dog was howling.
Yeah.
And I'm not someone who goes in for pet sentiment much.
No, you don't.
Well, it's bizarre. The way Pixie and Jetta, those were poodles. Pixie was the white one, Jetta was the black one. She adored them, obviously. She tried to teach them to sing, and there are recordings of her singing and them trying to sing. But before we get to her death, I also wanted to say this movie does what, unfortunately, several biographies have done, which is to say Onassis forbade her from singing, which is grossly untrue. So firstly, going back to Callas and Onassis meet, they met in September 1957. She would say later on, I was quite indifferent to him then. She was married to Giovanni Battista Meneghini, who was 28 years her senior. Onassis, though, also was a lot older than her. They did not have an affair. They later had a relationship, but Onassis invited Callas and her husband Meneghini on a cruise. She did not want to go. So there was none of this that Jodie depicts in this script of, I knew if I went, my life would be decided or something, none of that at all, because she was married to her husband. Now, they had been having marital troubles because he kept insisting she sing even when she felt unwell. She was getting exhausted. And also, he was entertaining all these offers that had nothing to do with opera. She got an offer to sing in Las Vegas, cabaret. And she would have to explain to her husband, no, I'm an opera singer. And this German film company wanted to do a film called The Prima Donna and have her play the role. And she would have to say, no, I don't want to be in movies. In fact, during the Christina trip in July 1959, one thing, by the way, the movie gets right was, yes, the cruise began on the 21st of July 1959. That's true. During that trip, Carl Foreman, one of the producers of the Guns of Navarone, which would eventually star Gregory Peck and Irene Papas, came on to the yacht and offered her the main leading lady role there. And she didn't want to do it. Now, Meneghini was aghast at all of this because he would tell her land is what matters. He was all about making money here. And she had let him take control of her finances, but also of the negotiations with opera house managers. And you asked about why was she known as a diva. Part of that, yes, she fell unwell, and the press didn't want to report that. They wanted to say she was a diva. The other part was her husband caused some problems for opera house managers by demanding higher and higher salaries. And while they were on the Christina, he actually told her, so he was trying to persuade her to take these film roles. And she said, well, why are you trying to persuade me? We have quite a lot of money. He said, well, not as much as you think. And then she found out that he had invested a lot of their money in forgeries of paintings. And, and this was her money. She was really the breadwinner, and he was managing their finances and, getting the best salaries for her as a singer. Onassis was an amazing businessman. So she consulted with him. Meneghini said, oh, you're having an affair. She said, no, I'm not. And she said, how about I take over the management of my career? He said, no way. And she tried to sort it out. They left the Christina together on the 11th of August. He left her. And then he proceeded to create a fictional diary of events using letter-headed paper from their house. It's just pages with letter-headed pages written in pen. You're putting in different dates. I found my wife in bed with Onassis. And she was aghast. She was in shock that he's making up this story. And eventually, so he files for a legal separation. Back then in Italy, there was no divorce. There would be no divorce until late 1970 because it was a Catholic country. So you could only file for a legal separation, which did divide assets, but it was not a divorce. And she would write to her lawyer in July 1960. I found this letter because I tracked down the grandson of her lawyer, her legal separation lawyer. She would write, can you tell Meneghini's lawyer to tell him to stop with that made-up story about Onassis. And she underlined made up. This was in Italian, so storia inventata about Onassis, because Meneghini was saying, Onassis must give me, $1 million or however much, or else I will go to the press and tell them more and more about this affair, which never happened. Of course, eventually Callas and Onassis had a relationship, but they did not have an adulterous affair. They did not leave their spouses for each other. Onassis was also having problems with his wife, Tina, by the time they began their relationship. So there was maybe adultery in the legal sense because you couldn't divorce in Italy, but there wasn't infidelity. And also Onassis did not forbid her to sing. On the contrary, he was trying to get her to, I think he was trying to get involved with the Monte Carlo Opera House at one point. He knew she was really nervous because of vocal problems, so he tried to set up a Maria Callas television company with the aid of Roberto Arias, who was British ambassador to Panama and the husband of Margot Fontaine, the ballerina, but apparently he was good with finances, so he was trying to organize that. He also corresponded with Jack Warner of Warner Brothers and with Spiros Skouras, who was chairman of 20th Century Fox, in a bid to arrange for a film of Tosca. He spent years trying to arrange this, but as Callas herself said, eventually familiarity breeds contempt. So they got on each other's nerves. I will also add for your listeners, because this is never mentioned, Callas and Onassis never lived together. They were very independent individuals. They were not married. So you can kind of say that for at least half the year, they were in a long-term relationship. She had her career, he had his career. It so happened that they had problems in their respective careers pretty much at the same time, because his airline, Olympic Airways, was going through terrible losses. So he was being kind of publicly humiliated as a result of that. And they got on each other's nerves, and she left him in July 1968, around the 25th of July. He married Jacqueline Kennedy on the 20th of October 1968. Before doing that, he tried to get Maria back desperately. He would send her bouquets, he would call her, she wouldn't take his calls. And she announced, she would tell friends she had broken up with him. But of course, when he did eventually marry Jacqueline Kennedy, she was heartbroken because he hadn't told her. But you can kind of say, but you wouldn't take his call, so how could he have told you?
So, just skipping to there's this scene where I guess she continues to meet Jeffrey Tate, who is not named Jeffrey Tate in this movie. And at one point, I'm not sure if they're insinuating that the spotlight guy lets the journalist in, but a journalist comes in and makes a recording from the spotlight space at the top of the theater, which I'm curious about how he has the audio to do that from there. They leave the theater and the reporter is there with the tape recorder and he starts pressuring her with questions. Ferruccio gets rough on him.
I think they were trying to get at a moment in March 1976 when a reporter, not from Le Figaro, which is where this fictional journalist is from, but from Le Journal du Dimanche, which was kind of a tabloid back then, managed to find a way to sneak into the theatre and take photos of her. She hurt herself, she was distraught, and she started crying, and this reporter took photos of her crying. He did not record her singing, and certainly, also, I was very surprised throughout this movie, firstly by how brusque everybody would be, telling her you have no voice. I'm pretty sure nobody ever said that to her. Except for me, I mean, not in that way. Of course, people who worked with her would have told her, you're not in good voice today, or, you're having problems. Nobody's going to approach Maria Callas and say, oh, your voice is gone. And also surprised by how Maria Callas, this fictional version of her, apparently let down her pride to tell JFK, as well as several other people, oh, I'm having vocal struggles. Actually, if you go through all of her interviews, now, of course, towards the end, she does say, I had problems. And in fact, she told the writer Dacia Mareni, who was a famous Italian novelist, she said, the voice has never been destroyed. It doesn't get ruined. Because quite a lot of the time, she was trying to be in denial of this. She would never have publicly said, I'm having struggles. She did when she came back, because this isn't mentioned in the film at all. In the film, it's constantly implied that she stopped singing a long time ago, and that's gone. The last time she sang was a long and arduous concert tour with the tenor Giuseppe Di Stefano, who was also the last man in her life. She had a relationship with him years after she broke up with Onassis. This concert tour lasted 14 months, from 1973 to November 1974. And she did give interviews then when, of course, she had to openly say, she would actually say, my voice is not what it was, and then she would kind of detract from that and say, but who is who they were, 10 or 20 years ago. So she was far too proud in that context. But anyway, yeah, the photographer took a picture, published them, and because she had been promised total privacy by the theatre, she sued the tabloid and she got 300,000 francs in damages, which was the equivalent of less than $1,000 at the time. So not much. But she wasn't attacked by a reporter, and she certainly did not attack a reporter, and Ferruccio certainly never attacked or defended her against the reporter.
And this all happens inside 1 week in this movie where she's not eating. And I guess there is awards talk. So we have a phrase that we use for when an actor delivers a scenery-chomping performance in hopes they will get an award nomination, which is Oscar-bation, which I think Ms. Jolie may be guilty of, unless she does, in fact, get nominated for something.
Yeah, I mean, I can just say off the top, it looks like the odds. I've been reading way too much, what's speculation around the 2024 Academy Awards. It is very much the kind of performance and the kind of film that gets nominated for a Best Actress award and for other awards. It is Oscar-batory. Even if it does get nominated, it's still the kind of thing, it feels like it was made for award purposes. And I would say also the odds are very good too, because, Kristen Stewart was nominated for Spencer and Natalie Portman was nominated for Jackie. So seems like this might just follow that theme.
I had no selections for dialogue this week. Everything sounded like the scriptwriter was trying too hard to write things that would be quotable. Sarah, can you please give our listeners a quick refresher on how we score movies?
Certainly. We rate movies on a scale of 1 to 10 across 10 areas that we find to be subjectively and or objectively important to most films, but specially tailored to specific issues particular to biopics. If you want more details on how we score movies, please scroll down our webpage at biopicapodcaststory.podbean.com. You'll also find a record of our scores for past episodes.
Would also highly recommend listening to our special introductory episode, Introduction, Who Are We and What Are We Doing?, where we give a rundown of the methodology, why it matters to us, and some of the inspirations behind this podcast.
And with that out of the way, let's score this thing. Do you want to go first, Rena?
Sure. So for outward appearances, hair, and makeup, I gave it an 8. I thought everyone, insofar as hair and makeup could do something for them, looked like who they were supposed to be. It seemed period accurate, and everyone looked lovely.
Fair. So outward appearances, I gave it a 9. I loved the way everybody looked. Seemed fairly accurate.
I also wanted to mention, because I didn't have a chance to mention this in the podcast in terms of appearances and style, Maria Callas did not smoke. In this film, there's a lot about smoking. Obviously, she might have smoked a cigarette 6 or 7 times in her life in total. Not only did she not smoke, but she wouldn't let her friend Panagis Fagotis enter her apartment in Paris because he constantly smoked cigars. So she did not destroy her voice by smoking, because it seemed to be like there was some hint of that in this movie. And I understand that's a part of the style of the 70s where most people were still smoking, but that was not the case. But now, is your score of outward appearances, is it accuracy or is it just aesthetic?
It's just aesthetic. It's hair, makeup, and it's whether people resemble physically who they're supposed to be, as opposed to capturing spirit.
Well, Jolie's physique is so not Callas in this time. I can't give this higher than a 4, probably, and I'm only giving a 4 because they made the guy who looked like Jeffrey Tate look, I imagine, a bit like Jeffrey Tate.
Can I give one thing that I am really glad about that I haven't talked about yet?
Sure.
That they didn't do? I'm really glad they didn't put a nose on her. I was very relieved to see that they were like, you carry this through, such as it is, carry it through performance, without because I hate prosthesis in this here, the year of our Lord 2024. Like, let's just not do it. So I was really glad that they didn't do that.
She's such an aloof performer, and honestly, about 3 years ago, she appeared in a Marvel film playing an aloof superhero / goddess, where I swear it was exactly the same part. She just goes on screen every few years and looks glamorous now. Acting and casting, I gave it a 6. Yeah, it was more mediocre, and there were some sensitive, like, I liked the guy playing Jeffrey Tate. I thought most of the people were sensitive in what they were doing.
Yeah, same, 6.
I feel bad because I have so much sympathy for actors, and I really dislike reading harsh reviews that really, tear down an actor. Because I'm also a novelist, so I do come at art from a creative perspective as well as a critical perspective. I know Angelina Jolie put in some effort to the role, but to be honest, to me, it felt like she just watched a few Callas interviews from the last few years of her life and had no desire to capture the changes in her and Callas from being happy and excited and lively and fun to being depressed. There was something just consistently moody in her performance, and I mean, as I said, I have seen other women in this role. Nobody's ever really going to be Maria Callas for me at all, but I have seen other actresses navigate through different emotions. At least they've really done that, and she didn't do that. The other actors in this film, I felt, were really inhibited by this strange, draggy direction, which did make everything feel very, very heavy, or just to the point of parody. I think I'll probably give it a 2 because I just don't think, not so much because the actors were bad, but because I don't think anyone was really given a strong chance to be much better.
Passage of Time, I gave it a 7 because I understood everything was happening inside a week. I understood days passing inside that week, and I understood that everything else was a flashback, so it didn't really matter. Sarah?
From a purely technical standpoint, this was like almost my platonic ideal of Passage of Time. I gave it a 9. It gave me all the breadcrumbs my idiot brain needs to understand where we are. Like, we had black and white flashbacks. We had filming, film stock changes when we were shooting the interviews. We had the clapboard to tell us where we were. We open, and I know it's 7 days. My tiny brain was so happy with the technical way that this movie created a passage of time.
Well, the thing is, if you're using black and white to flash back, then you'd think it makes things easy. But on the other hand, they had these flashbacks to completely different opera performances from different times of Callas' life, when she would have looked different, when she would have felt different, when she would have been at varying levels of popularity. It accomplishes the task of saying this is present, this is past, but the past is massive. So where are we? Are we in 1959? Are we in 1953? Is anything really accomplishing that much? Because considering she's in costume and there isn't, because it's mostly her on stage and without even other people around her, we don't know if it's, 1949 or 1959.
You reminded me something I'd forgotten, which was that Maria does one of my least favorite things that biopics do, which I'm not sure how old this younger version of her is supposed to be, but I really hate it when there's a child version of someone and their way of showing some kind of emotional healing is to have them go hug the inner child.
God, yeah.
And they do that. I don't know if it seems like they're in the shabby Greek apartment, so it could be that younger Maria is supposed to be under 18. But Sarah, you've heard, I have literally barked at my TV screen, don't hug the inner child.
Yeah. So Passage of Time, I'm giving it a 5 because I think if you are alluding to different periods of time, you've got to make a way of making that apparent. Because for all, if you're watching this with not much knowledge of Callas' career, for all you know, she might have had an amazing career in a span of 1 year or 2 years, depending how you count. But really, her career takes off quite a bit in 49, and the glittering part really lasts until 64. That's 15 years in which you're dipping into one performance or another.
Okay. Costuming, I gave it an 8. I thought everything looked glamorous and high quality. Sarah?
Same. I thought that they put a lot of care into the costuming, and seeing at the end when they showed the real Callas and the clothing that she was wearing, like you saw the detail that they went to recreate those looks.
They did put in a lot of effort to recreate the looks. I was somewhat puzzled by Bruna's weird outfits and Ferruccio's as well. I mean, when they were doing the housework, I'm not sure what they were going for there. The thing is, it really does. It's mostly staying in Callas' the last year of her life. I mean, she still put on a nice mink coat when she went out, which I think the Jolie character does as well. So I'd give it a 7.
Okay, quality of the script, I gave it a 4, which is like on the lower side of mediocre, no real zingers.
Same, 4.
Can I give it 0? No, you know what? I won't give it 0 because I am a classical music critic, and obviously, if you do something, you deserve at least a 1. So, somebody typed up a few words, so 1. It's not like the page was blank. The page wasn't blank, so there you go.
All right. For accuracy, I gave a 3 because this is still more accurate than The Conqueror and not as irritating as Tennessee Johnson. Sarah?
I gave it a 2. There was a city called Paris. There was a woman called Maria Callas. She sang opera. They got the generalities down.
I mean, I'm giving this a lower score than we gave Caligula, but that was the 3rd episode and we didn't know what we were doing, really.
Caligula was more accurate.
Happens. Okay, I'm giving it a 1 because, yes, you're right. There was a city called Paris. Maria Callas was a soprano, and she did have dark hair and wear glasses, and she did actually have a maid called Bruna, and she had a butler called Ferruccio, and she did sing those arias. I mean, they didn't make up an aria, and they didn't attribute an aria to her or an opera to her that she hadn't performed.
And nobody interacted with a dinosaur. Yes, storytelling, I gave it a 4, low end of mediocre, and I guess I felt a bit of indifference. Sarah?
I gave it a 7. I did like the structure in terms of the way that it was propulsive. I didn't like the execution necessarily or the dialogue, but the structure of it pleased me.
I would give it a 2 because the motif is very basic. So, older woman, not really that old, but I don't know if the audience caught on. She was 53 when she died. Older woman looking back on her great successes, feeling sad. It's a very cliched portrait of any artist, fictional or real. And also, as many, because I've read quite a few reviews, and also as an opera podcast I was on pointed out, if you don't have a familiarity with opera and with Callas's career, how do you know what you're looking back at? There were also, in terms of the storytelling, and this is where opera love comes into it, if you do love opera or not, there are such cliches. I mean, when fictional Callas meets fictional JFK, the piano is playing A Forse Lui, which means maybe he's the one from La Traviata. So it's like I don't know, if you had a Spice Girls biopic and you had Jerry Halliwell coming onto a guy at a bar and Wannabe in the background, I mean, hopefully that will never happen. And then when Onassis was dying, the music in the background, it was an instrumental version of E lucevano le stelle, which means the stars were shining. It is the aria sung by Mario Cavaradossi in Tosca, which is before Mario is going to be shot and killed. So, the love of the heroine Tosca is going to be shot and killed. So that's another super on the nose. Look, her lover's dying like Cavaradossi, even though Cavaradossi was shot and killed, which is totally different. So I would give it a 2 because I think a lot here is very indeterminate for someone unfamiliar with the material. And then for someone familiar with the material, there are incredible cliches in the choices of arias in the background.
For production value, I gave it an 8. I could reasonably well see where the money went.
Same, 8. I loved the vanity in her dressing room. I would give it an 8 for that alone.
Oh my God, that apartment. Oh, I want a bed like that.
It looked nothing like her real apartment. Why not shoot it from her? She had a gorgeous view. No, it doesn't look cheap. I will say, obviously, it's going for the dark colors, and that's the essence of the film, but it just seems like such a tacky choice. So I'll go with a 6 for production values.
Production, direction, decision making, I gave it a 5. Sarah?
God, we're so aligned today. I also gave it a 5. Some things I liked, some things I really didn't like.
Sophia?
Well, I'm gonna have to go with a 2 because I don't think this is a well-directed film. I don't know if I'm supposed to be commenting on this because I'm not a movie critic. I'm just kind of here as a Callas expert, but the way the camera dollied in closing in on, and slowly, the amount of time that took to just dolly in and dolly out, and it just seemed crazy to me.
Yeah, I know. Don't get me started on the overuse of the standing dolly zoom shot, but I think I was also reflecting how much I hate inner children. The decision to have one bugs me. And for Do We Care, I gave it a 4. I cared about the pianist who was trying to work with her. I felt badly that this fictional Maria was exacerbating her butler's back problems. I did feel sad for this woman who'd had this amazing life, but for the most part, it was on the end of caring. Sarah?
I did care very much about her. I gave it an 8. What really won me over was seeing the real her at the end. I was very affected by how hard her life was, and just this idea of having so much talent, but also so much struggle. And I think what I'm also I'm just sad about is, Sophia, you've talked a lot about how generous she was and giving of herself she was. And I don't feel like we saw that in this movie. They kind of elided over it a little bit here and there with her staff. I feel like that warmth, I'm sad that wasn't better portrayed in this film.
I mean, generally, I think looking back, she would have hated anybody using those recordings. They're using her real recordings and they're using real footage at the end, which is manipulative. It also kind of defeats the purpose of the biopic because, isn't the point to take poetic license? To me, it's cheating because it's not a documentary. A documentary can use as much real stuff as it wants. A biopic is supposed to be a work of fiction, even if it is inspired by real life. So it's a bit like, I don't know, going to an audition for a role and using someone else's tape. The question, do I care? Obviously, I care enormously about the real Maria Callas. But I think if I had gone into this not knowing much about Maria Callas, I would have been very, very bored. So I would give it a 2 because those recordings are going to have an effect. But I think actually most viewers they can separate that from what they're seeing. I think most of them can do that because at least so far, it doesn't seem to have a very high IMDb score, a very good critical reception. And I think if people were being kind of blindsided by the Callas voice, it would be doing better.
Okay, so have we all done our tallies?
Yep. I have a 5. Oh, sorry. I have a 5.1.
I have a 5.7.
3.2.
All right. So the average comes to I'm going to round here, 4.67. So, Maria, you did not earn a second opinion. You are on the low end of mediocre.
Alas.
And we don't get to read good reviews from IMDb and make fun of the people.
I'm sure that nobody's posted anything interesting yet there.
So most people posting are the Callas fans, which so far is depicting the idea that nobody's really interested in this film except for Callas fans, which at this point I'm happy about because I don't want people seeing this fictional version of Maria Callas.
Yeah, it's kind of a bummer.
So, Sophia, what should people watch instead?
If you have any interest in Maria Callas, you should go on YouTube and watch her interviews. But preferably check out interviews from the 50s and 60s because by the 70s she was quite depressed and she could be somewhat defensive in interviews. So the younger, happier Callas is better. In terms of films, do you want me to recommend a biopic to watch instead?
Sure.
I would definitely recommend I, Tonya because even though... No, but I would. Because what it does, and I know that Tonya Harding approved of it because she was at the Golden Globes and apparently I think she was weeping from joy or relief or something. I think a biopic, as a biographer, it's impossible to convey a whole life, especially not in a 90-minute movie or a 2-hour movie or even a 3-hour movie. It's impossible to convey a real person when we don't even really know ourselves, let alone others. But what you can do is you can convey a mood of something. And I think I, Tonya does convey the mood of the late 80s, early 90s, of a woman coming from a difficult background, wanting to succeed, the skating isn't that bad. I'm saying this as a super skating aficionado. I follow skating very closely. So I got a mood from that. So I would recommend that instead of this biopic, which didn't seem human to me at all, which is quite an achievement, because how can you use Maria Callas' recordings and not create a human film? But that was the result.
We'll chime in on I, Tonya. Great film. Sarah?
Mm-hmm. Oh my God, same. It's so good. I think that covers it for me this week. This is a huge bummer. Maybe skip it. But do watch I, Tonya, and do go to YouTube and check out the real Maria Callas and enjoy it. I would first of all like to thank Sophia very much for her time and the work that she put into preparing for this, and for being such a wonderful guest. We're so glad to have you. I hope we can come up with a reason to have you back. And everyone, please check out all of her links in the show notes.
Sophia, do you have anything that you would like to tell our listeners about? I know that you recently published a book, and also if you have any other articles or anything you'd like to plug, please tell us.
Yes, there's the Callas imprint, a centennial biography. For UK listeners, I recorded interviews for a documentary that is going to be broadcast on BBC Two on the 29th of December, called Maria Callas, The Final Act, but it's not as melodramatic as that, because I've seen it. And it's quite a good documentary. It's made with a lot of heart by the director Claire Bevan, with whom I collaborated quite a lot for this film. So it's not just that she filmed me. She borrowed my material. We talked about Callas for hours. She really loves Maria Callas, and she did a really good job. Yes, I do write classical music reviews on my Substack. Thank you for mentioning it, because I don't think anyone has so far on podcasts, but never mind. But I'm also a novelist. Basically what I do is I write television series in fiction. So I'm a TV baby. I grew up in the 90s and early 2000s watching TV. I did read books too. But what I mean to say is that I think for my whole life, I wanted to create a TV series in fiction. So The Crooked Little Pieces is a saga following twins Annelies and Isabel, who are half Dutch and half German, but they live in England, at least they do, from the age of 6, from around the 20s to the late 60s. And if you like sagas, if you like long-form stories, because you want to accompany characters on long journeys, then check it out. It's very relationship-driven. It's not romance exactly. There are romances in it, but it's very relationship, complex character-driven stuff. So, yeah. And also, the social media stuff. So at The Crepuscular Press on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, Pinterest. I think that's it. Yeah.
Fantastic. So, Sarah, can you please take us out?
Yes, of course. So if you like the show, please leave us a 5-star rating and subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and tell a friend, or better yet, plural friends, and share us on social media. We hear it helps. You can follow us on Instagram, where we have visual aids from our episodes. Our Instagram handle is Biopic a Podcast Story. So do check us out there, and we'll link to that in the show notes as well. Please check out our webpage at biopicapodcaststory.podbean.com to see the official episode ratings for all of the movies that we've done so far. And if you'd like to get in touch, you can email us at biopiclistenermailbag@gmail.com.
Yes, we also now have accounts on Threads and Blue Sky. Tune in next week when we'll be talking about Bohemian Rhapsody. Happy holidays. That is our Christmas Hanukkah gift to our audiences. We are doing the most popular musical biopic and the film people request the most. And thank you again to our wonderful guest, Sophia.